Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of the Jay-Z Show. We normally come to you every 2 weeks, every Saturday, but today, in light of the really horrific events which have taken place in Bangladesh over the last day or so, John and I thought it would be best for us to sit now and really have this discussion. It's a discussion Bangladesh needs. It's a discussion Bangladesh is having, and we wanted to be part of that conversation. John, welcome. Thank you for. I know it's very late for you. You're tuning in. You're tuning in from the U.S. So thank you for being here.
No, thanks, Zafar. And yeah, thanks for agreeing to have this special episode. And I hope we've got some folks watching us live. You know, my sense is that certainly people in Bangladesh, but even those of us who care about Bangladesh around the world, nobody's gotten much sleep in the last few days. I know the other night I was up late and went to bed, woke up in the morning, and my feeds and inboxes were full. And even during the day when I thought everyone in Dhaka would be sleeping, I kept hearing from people. So it's clearly one of those times where, everyone is glued to whether it's their television or their mobile device, trying to understand what's happening.
Well, I mean, it's a very, very shocking situation. And of course, in many ways, this started a week ago with the shooting of Usman Hadi. And then it was just, I guess, 2 nights ago that he succumbed to his injuries in a Singapore hospital. And that, of course, was the spark which led to everything which happened. I guess it's 2 nights ago now. But tell me, I was, of course, I woke to this. I know many people, of course, were awake and following this in real time. I myself was asleep and I woke to the news. In America, because of the time difference, I guess you probably were aware of this unfolding in real time.
Right. And, it's always different when you're living through events versus when you're looking back at what's happened in the past.
Sure.
And, from the time of the shooting and as information about the extent of the injuries became known, I think it was pretty clear to anyone with a medical background that the odds of Hadi's survival were very slim. I mean, obviously, there are miraculous recoveries. Malala Yousafzai is a good example. I think it was appropriate for the government to try its best to get him the care. And, from personal experience, there's nothing better than medical care in Singapore. So the prayers and the extraordinary efforts to save his life were worthwhile. But I think most people would have realized that the tragic end is what was most likely, which then I think casts a different eye on what happened after his death, because it could have been anticipated. And maybe for some, it was anticipated. So I think we have a kind of a diversion. I mean, on the one hand, you have people who probably anticipated what was going to happen and then planned certain moves. And then there were others who probably should have anticipated it and didn't take the appropriate steps. And I think it's this combination of both planning and lack thereof that combined in this witch's brew to then lead to the tragic events that we saw unfold.
Yeah, and I mean, getting back to the actions which were taken or which were not taken by the interim government, I mean, I think this has to be viewed as a catastrophic failure of the government. It's really, this will stay as a permanent black mark on their record to preside over something such as this. And, and more than anything else, it gives absolute, it gives a lot of fuel to the government's enemies. And for those of us who have been, supportive of this transition period in Bangladesh, for those of us who have been trying to be supportive of the government, understanding that it's operating in a very, very difficult situation, and that at this particular moment in time for Bangladesh, we really have very little better alternative, and that what we need in Bangladesh is to have calm and peace as we move towards elections in February. I think this has come, as a disappointment, as a real shock that they didn't plan better to avert this crisis, which in many ways seems now self-inflicted.
Yeah. So I was in Dhaka in March of this year, which was, my first visit in a decade and my first visit since the events of August 2024. And I was surprised in one of my first meetings with somebody in the interim government. They said to me flat out that we're a weak government. And
Hmm.
I think that's partially by design, right? The way the
Okay.
interim government was set up, by who was in it. I mean, this was never going to be a very strong government, but there's
Sure.
plenty of blame to go around. I think the challenge as an analyst is if you try to explain something, you'll be accused of trying to excuse it. So I'm going to try to explain without excusing.
Okay.
And so
Sure.
doing what I'll say is this is a failure which can't be pinned at any one individual's door. It was a failure of the entire system. It was certainly a failure of the interim government itself. But it was also a failure of the institutions, which admittedly had been weakened over the previous 15 years. It was a failure of security forces, intelligence. It was a failure of all of those who should have anticipated that this was going to happen or something like this and taken steps. Now, at the end of the day, it still might not have been successful. And maybe we don't know the extent of planning that did take place. So maybe there'll
Hmm.
be an opportunity for the government at an appropriate time to talk more about what went wrong and do a real internal review, because this is still early in the election cycle. And over the next 2 months, there are plenty of risks ahead. So it's one thing to look at what happened to assign blame. I don't think that's very fruitful. What's important, though, is to look
Hmm.
at what happened, what went wrong, so that it doesn't happen again between now and February 12th.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely key. I mean, and I've written about this, you've written about this, that the real key is we have entered now, the final stretch of this government. We've entered now the final stretch before the election season, and everyone has been anticipating and waiting patiently for February 12. I think the key thing is to make sure that the elections are not derailed. And as you point out, what has happened in many ways has happened, and we can talk about it in the whys and the wherefores and who was to blame. But the most important thing is the lesson to be taken from this is to make sure that something like this does not recur. But I have to tell you, it seems to me that that is a non-trivial concern, and there's a non-trivial chance, because unfortunately what we have seen in Bangladesh is that the boiling point is remarkably low, and to start a conflagration is not difficult. You can't provide protection for everyone, um,
Mm-hmm.
and you have uh, a lot of people who would like to derail the elections. They are well resourced, and well organized, and appear to have a fair amount of protection one way or the other. So this is, I mean, I think we are entering very, very what's the word? I don't want to use the word dangerous. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to overstate it, but I certainly think it's a time for extreme caution and extreme vigilance.
No, absolutely. And in any planning process, you always have to realize that you're not the only actor. So as much as the government may make plans, as we used to say when I was teaching, the enemy also has a vote. So everyone is going
Yeah,
to study what happened, and they're going to learn lessons from that, and they're going to adapt and adjust going forward. So some of the vulnerabilities that Bangladesh currently has were very much exposed. Again, some of the weaknesses of the system, the influence and the impact of social media, the fact that you have large numbers of people, young people, who can be easily, I think, swayed and pushed in a certain direction. I mean, all of those factors are not going to go away. And even, today, as people prepare, for the funeral prayers, it's going to be a challenging day for security forces, and they're not going to get a break, because in the ensuing days there'll be other tests, and we have, in the very near future, Tariq Rahman's long-awaited return, which will be another huge challenge, I think, for the government and just
sure.
managing huge numbers of people.
Yeah, there's a massive security concern surrounding that. And, there has been speculation as to, what has held him back from returning to Bangladesh. And one of the theories making the rounds was security concerns. And of course, in light of this latest incident, one can see that, perhaps there is some justification for that. That is certainly clearly a legitimate concern. Um, but let's dial back a little, though, and talk a little bit about Hadi himself. And
Hmm.
let's we have a fair amount of time with us. I think we can
Sure.
start talking about Hadi a little, what he meant, uh, why he was targeted, and and how we can sort of take that discussion. Then I do very much want to talk about the fact that the two major newspapers in Bangladesh have been burnt to the ground. I mean, this, I think there's no way we can avoid that subject, and we have to have discussion. And then I think finally we'll talk about what does this mean in terms of elections. All three we've covered in brief in our
Hmm.
first 10 minutes, but let's speak a little bit. What's the word I'm looking for? Uh, a little bit more organization.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
starting with Hadi. So, what were your thoughts? I mean, did you know much about him prior to his killing? And what have you what are your think what's your thinking on that?
No, I mean, as I watched events over the past year and a half, he was always a background character. I mean, he was certainly not in a starring role, at least from somebody, sitting in my position. But he was always there. And, again, if you use the analogy of, watching a movie or a television show, he might have been in a supporting role. But he stole the scene, whenever he was in it. Again, he was
Right.
a very memorable figure. And, so much of that has been captured in the days, since the shooting, the small snippets of video or the images. I mean, obviously a very charismatic person. My Bangla is not as good as I wish it was, but even there, just to listen to him speak and his ability to engage with a crowd, he was certainly somebody who, was was a memorable person. And the more I've listened and read, people talking about him, it was clear that he was somebody special who had a bright future ahead of him. Whether or not he succeeded in winning a seat in parliament, which I'm guessing probably would have been a long shot,
Sure.
through other areas, he was going to make a difference. At least, again, that's the impression I have now, kind of looking at him in retrospect.
No, I mean, what I liked about him was that, and this is the thing, you may agree with him, you may disagree with him. There were many things on which I did disagree with him, and I think many people can. But I think even his strongest critics would concede that this was a man of integrity. Okay, and I think this is important in politics. This is a man of integrity. This was a man of conscience who said what he believed, who didn't trim his sails. And this is
Hmm.
important. I think one of the things we have seen, unfortunately, post the July Revolution, is that so many of the leaders of that movement have seemed to have become compromised in the eyes of the public. And I think one of the things which was great about Hadi was that was clear that that hadn't happened to him. And one of the things which I think is an underreported aspect of who he was as a political leader was the fact that he was running as an independent candidate in Dhaka 8. And as you say, I think with every knowledge that the chances of victory were extraordinarily slim. Okay? And what he understood was that politics is a long, hard slog. It's not something that that automatically becomes your birthright, regardless of what role you may have played in July. And he was ready for that slog. He understood that this was going to be a work of years, if not decades, which is something sometimes I feel that there's a little bit of impatience among a lot of the younger generation, and I understand that. You've seen off a dictator, you have brought down an authoritarian government, you want change. That comes with the territory, I think, of being young, and it's in many ways it's a very credit worthy thing. But of course, you do need patience because things take time. It takes time to build. It takes time to reform. It takes time to create the institutions necessary for a nation to move forward. I think he understood that, and he was willing. He was willing to be there for the long haul. So, I mean, I do think his killing was absolutely a tragedy for Bangladesh, and I do think his targeting was very carefully chosen, very carefully chosen, because I think his killers chose someone who really did have that potential to be the kind of leader, one of many perhaps, that Bangladesh would need moving forward. But, we needed people like Hadi, and I think the message has been sent very clearly with his killing. And it's kind of set people back on their heels.
Right. And, again, there's been a lot written and said in recent days about the linkages between 1971 and 2024. But, one of the linkages which immediately came to mind to me was we were also marking in recent days, the anniversary of December 14th. And, one of the last acts of the forces that were opposing Bangladesh's independence was to target intellectuals, those who would be responsible for building a future Bangladesh. So again, the echoing there of him being targeted, because I think, again, one of the interesting things about Hadi is that he was competing in the realm of ideas and ideals. And this whole idea of culture and nationalism and identity, again, you can agree or disagree. And I know that one of his hallmarks was a very strong view about Bangladesh's relationship with India, not just the previous regime, but the ecosystem or environment that it created or benefited from, and the extent to which that may have persisted after Sheikh Hasina's departure. So again, these are tough issues and controversial ones, but he was willing to take those on. And again, I think to your point, that it strikes me as a stretch to think it was a coincidence that somebody who cared about, spoke about the issues that he did, who had that persona and that potential, again, he was very deliberately targeted. And again, it may also have been that just by his nature and his style, the fact that he was very accessible to the people, he was there on the ground, didn't travel with a big retinue, lots of security. In some ways, that might have also made him a more likely or an easier target for those who carried out this attack.
Yeah. And that said, and of course, there is a lot of righteous anger, frustration, fury, sorrow, a massive outpouring of emotion following the announcement of his death. I mean, I think in a sense it was a delayed reaction because he was, fighting for his life in a Singapore hospital for 6 days. But I think after it happened, I'm not sure. I mean, I feel that while I understand the anger very well, and I understand the sense of frustration, the sense of impotence, which gives rise to the desire to want to do something, anything, to avenge his death, that I feel that that it was a tremendous own goal, to use a football terminology, what we call in Bangladesh a same side goal. Because you have so many people who are wanting to portray Bangladesh and Bangladeshis as, they want to portray Bangladesh as a country where everything is falling apart, where there is no rule of law, that there's all kinds of atrocities being committed on a daily basis. And I feel that this just fed into that narrative.
Yeah. So as we've talked about before, I'm an amateur historian, and you didn't ask me today about the photo behind me. So I'm going to move my head.
I did not yet. Yeah, tell me.
And,
yeah. I think I recognize that.
Right. So that's the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, which was the site of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. The room behind me is the room that he came out onto the balcony and he was shot by a sniper across the road. And I mention that because, I think about U.S. history and I think about the year of 1968. You had, the assassinations of Malcolm X, of Martin Luther King, of Robert Kennedy. And again, these assassinations that took place in the United States also led to anger and outbursts, and particularly, following, the Martin Luther King and his assassination, you did have riots. You had riots in urban areas, from African Americans. And again, you had, I'm not saying that Hadi was Martin Luther King. He may have been more Malcolm X.
Sure.
or he may have been more, pick another character. But regardless, I think, the reaction of people seeing somebody snatched away who had this, persona and had, you know, had such a devoted following and inspired such hope. So
Yeah.
again, I think, as you said, it was a delayed reaction. It could have been anticipated. The challenge, which was not met in this case, was how to channel that anger, that emotion in a way. Um,
Yeah.
you know, this is again, it may not have been successful in any case. I've said publicly, and I think we may have talked before about the Chris Hani assassination in South Africa, something which
Right.
again
Yeah.
reminded me of this. And even though Nelson Mandela and others were able to channel that into something positive in terms of, progress on the peace process, there was still violence. There were still outbursts. So, yeah, it's an incredibly difficult time.
True. I mean, I think it is asking too much for people for them to say, well, look, for you to say that, look, yes, something like this has happened, but we don't expect there to be any kind of outburst of emotion. I mean, I think um, that would be unrealistic. That said, I think the fact that it manifested itself in the way it did in the targeting of the Daily Star and Prothom was, I think, especially uh, unfortunate in that. And this is something which I would like to talk about. It seems that there's this narrative which has been formed, in certain circles of the Daily Star and Prothom being, handmaidens of the deposed Hasina regime. And in my assessment, in my analysis, I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. I have worked in media here in Bangladesh. I used to work at the Daily Star for many years until 2009. And I have to tell you, when I was there, and even in the years afterwards, certainly when the Awami League came to power, Hasina saw the Daily Star and Prothom as public enemy number one and number two. Okay.
Right.
And she did everything in her power over 15 years to bring about the destruction of these two newspapers. And the idea that they have now been cast is these villain figures in this new dispensation is, I think, incredibly unfortunate.
Yeah. No, particularly when you and I both know that there are business interests and rivalries, including in the media world, which may have played into these narratives as some of the
Sure.
competitors of Daily Star and Prothom may have sought to gain some advantage. But I've been thinking about this today, and again, back to the question of identity. Everyone has a complicated identity. And in Bangladesh, too often there's these binaries. So you're secular or you're, an extremist. You are pro-India, you're anti-India, pro-US, anti, etc. But people are not comfortable with nuance. So just because you are secular in your worldview and outlook doesn't mean you're pro-Awami League or you're pro-India or you're all these other pros or anti-antis.
Sure.
Similarly, if you are against the Awami League, if you are against India, if you have other views, that doesn't automatically mean you're an Islamic extremist. And again, I think this simplification and the
Yeah.
characterization that's taking place outside of Bangladesh and maybe even inside of Bangladesh contributes to the environment we're in. And again, I've watched far too much Indian television and talk shows over the past couple of days and keep yelling at my computer screen as people, again, have this misplaced perception of the reality in Bangladesh, or at least the Bangladesh that I know.
Yeah, I mean, and that brings me to sort of the third point I wanted to discuss is that, this has been a incredible own goal on the part of the interim government, and certainly this is something that they um, should have been able to foresee and should have been able to forestall, even if there had been no, for whatever reason, there had been no steps taken prior, preparatory steps. Certainly, once the incidents began to unfold, they could have been far quicker in their response, and they weren't. And what this has done is this has just fed into the narrative which has been created, and we see today on Indian media and Indian social media that Bangladesh has descended into this Hobbesian nightmare. There's no rule of law, mobs control the streets. And and this is being propagated all over the internet. My question is, how harmful will that be to
Mhm.
Bangladesh in the next 2 months? Will this, in fact, is there a danger that this can derail the electoral process, which we're still hopeful will happen in 2 months?
Right. So, part of this I think depends on the feedback loops. Part of it depends on, the position that leadership takes. And I'll take another example, again, a tragic example from the last few days. This
Yeah,
lynching that was reported in Mymensingh involving this member of the
Deepu
Hindu
Chandra Das.
community.
That's
Right.
correct. Yeah,
Exactly. Again, a horrific incident. And, it was chilling to see the videos that were circulating. I mean, I couldn't
absolutely
watch them, right?
shocking. Yeah.
Shocking, terrible, horrible. Again, I don't know the details. I don't know who carried this out, what their motivations were beyond, religious bigotry. And the fact that these took place at the same time as this violence following Hadi's killing led people to connect dots in a way that may or may not be appropriate. Again, that as far as I can tell from outside, there's no direct linkage between Hadi's death, the burning of Daily Star and Prothom, and this young man being killed violently, horribly in Mymensingh. But certainly there are some who are painting this picture which connects all those dots.
Mm. Well, I think what you're trying to say is that they're not necessarily connected in terms of one has to do with the other. But of course, the reason the Prothom and Daily Star were targeted is in response to Hadi's death, for
No,
whatever
that part,
reason.
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
For
that part,
whatever
yeah.
reason, the mob believed, that they were somehow complicit and that they were at fault.
Right. No, certainly, yeah, that part was definitely connected. But what I'm saying is then to kind of take it that one step further and say that then that this incident in Mymensingh is also connected. I think that's a
No, I
stretch.
agree with you. I mean, it seems to be that was, as you said, it was a terrible tragedy and an absolute, absolutely shocking. And unfortunately, there have been other incidents over the last year and a half where members of the Hindu community have been targeted, and that's something which we need to talk about, and that's something we need to address as a nation. And we can't just sweep it under the rug. It's possible that the vision people have in India, or which is being propagated on Indian media, is overstated, and that and a lot of what they believe is happening is not happening. But that's not to say that's not to say that there have not been incidents. There absolutely have been incidents. That absolutely is something that we in Bangladesh need to take cognizance of, and frankly do much better on. No
Yeah.
question.
And there's a feedback loop for the election. So, I mean, one is, whether people feel safe to go and vote, whether they'll vote in a festive manner. And obviously, there'll be greater concerns among minority communities. So,
Yeah.
candidates, parties need to reach out to them. And I think I've said, publicly and privately that a key to this election being free and fair is that journalists and observers feel free to go out there and report on what's happening, including any, um, you know, issues involving candidates or the administration. But if you're creating an environment now where journalists are afraid to do their job because if they cross a line or if they cross a political party or an individual, they're going to find themselves targeted. That vitiates all of that. So it's important that on the communication side and in terms of the actions of the government and the political parties, that they take into account this fear that exists, not to dismiss it, but to take effective steps to deal with them.
Yeah, I think that is where the wheels hit the road over the next 2 months. We want, and if you'd asked me as recently as 1 week ago, I was always very bullish on elections. I said no, everything is going to be just fine. Elections are happening. I know a lot of people in the chattering classes have been saying that, oh well, something will happen. When I talked to people in the interim government, they had also told me that no, we have everything under control. They thought that the Awami League's ability to mobilize and do street demonstrations was almost nil, and they were very confident that they would be able to that they would be able to control the situation. We saw this, in fact, on the 17th of November when Hasina's verdict came down and there was very, very little unrest. And that was in many ways that the government saw that as a good sort of test case scenario for the kind of the power the Awami League would be able to motivate, because of course the Awami League have made they've made it very public. They've not made any secret of the fact that they do want to disrupt elections. They want to make sure, they even say that there will be violence. And so this is very much out there in the open. But of course, what we're seeing now is that you don't need Awami League elements, Chhatru League, what have you, to be the ones fomenting the violence, because what you can do is, if you can trigger something, and then you have different elements of the polity, different elements of the society coming together and being outraged. So in that sense, the killing of Hadi was absolutely it was absolutely, I think, meant as a provocation as well. I mean, I think there were many reasons for it, which you've discussed earlier, but the final reason was a provocation. I think that they wanted to elicit exactly the response they did.
Right. No, I mean, I think that the killing of Hadi, the response, I mean, this has added steroids to the situation. So, again, on the issue we were talking about with, journalism and, as I was talking before about identity, this has started to, hit me close to home. I'm a retired diplomat dabbling now in the areas of journalism or kind of analysis. And what I'm realizing is the challenges of not only trying to be objective, but being perceived as objective in a world in which everyone wants to put you in one category or another, sins of commission, sins of omission. And as we've joked about in private, but now is become very public. Everyone wants to put me, give me a label. I go through various stages of I'm, pro Awami League, or I'm pro BNP, I'm pro Eunice, and latest I've been put in another camp. So, I don't know what you do about this.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about, no, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I think prior to August 5th, people who, again, like I said, like to put people into camps, like to put people into boxes and label them. They said, well, John is very tight with the BNP. Then all of a sudden, without as much as a by your leave, you're now the principal spokesperson, allegedly, for the Yunus government. And now I think there are photographs which are being which are sort of making the rounds in people. And of course, I mean, the thing is this: photographs are there. We all have photo ops, and we're all caught in photographs with people for various reasons. But then to spin an entire narrative around it is, I think, taking things a little too far. But is that something you wanted to talk about?
Yeah. No, I did want to talk about it because, I've been thinking about this, not just for myself, but, it's made me more sensitive to how I look at, other actors in the political arena. So obviously, as a diplomat, part of my job was to engage with people across the political spectrum, across society, everywhere I've been. And I've tried to do the same in my, my retired life in this new incarnation. But, somebody, as you said, is always going to try to put you in a box. So, I think what you're referring to, and what we discussed briefly, was photographs that are circulating of myself, one of these New York-based journalists who's become very infamous, Elias Hossein, then the Amir of Bangladesh Jamaat Islami, Dr. Shafiqur Rahman, and the Jamaat's U.S. spokesperson, Dr. Naqibur Rahman. So again, several people who, while they may have one persona that I think they have a clear political bias as well, have used this to not only, kind of resuscitate the old, foreign regime change narrative, and going back to the 111 period, the whole, alleged U.S. role in the -2, taking out old WikiLeaks cables, and then spinning this story. But as you say, I've probably taken photographs with hundreds, if not thousands, of Bangladeshi politicians and figures over the years. So again, I'm smart enough to know when someone is taking my photo. And if I don't want my photo to be taken, I'll ask them not to. But for the most part, I see this as relatively innocuous.
Yeah.
So recently, the Emir of Bangladesh Jamaat Islami was in the United States. I had met with him several times in Bangladesh during my visits. I'd met with his predecessors, just as I'd met with the heads of other Bangladesh political parties. There was an opportunity for me to meet with him in New York, which I gladly accepted. And as I was going into the room to meet him, he was finishing up a meeting with somebody else. And as is Bangladeshi custom and fashion, we decided we would all have a photo opportunity together. So we took a photograph, and my meeting took place. The other individual went off to his next meeting, and kind of we parted ways. The photograph was put on social media, as photographs are, and while some people called attention to it at the time, all of a sudden this has become, Exhibit A, that I am somehow personally involved in this nefarious conspiracy theory to thwart
Yeah, well,
Bangladesh's election.
and indeed, and were that indeed to be the case, my suspicion is you wouldn't actually have taken the photograph. You see,
Probably not. Probably
the
not.
fact that the photograph exists, surely, if anyone is thinking straight, would suggest that there is nothing nefarious. You see, but of course, that's not how people think. And of course, as you said, you were going into the meeting. Elias was coming out. You didn't actually even really meet him, other than to have that photograph taken.
Right, exactly. So again, I mean, I'm not so naive as to think that people won't use these things for their own benefit, but it was a reminder to me, and I think it also will point to, again, the role that social media will play. Um, we're broadcasting on YouTube. I'm active on the X platform, trying to reach an international audience. But I know, in Bangladesh, the Facebook ecosystem is very important. And I think, again, back to our earlier discussion about the threats to election and the threats of further violence, I think one of the real areas to watch is the role of social media. And I know the social media companies care about this, but I'm not sure how much attention they'll be placing on Bangladesh. I did note today, though, in I think a helpful sign, the government did put out a notice saying that they had set up a monitoring cell that if people saw threats being circulated on social media, they could report those, so the government could look into them and then communicate with, Meta or the other platform. So that was a positive sign.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke at a roundtable discussion about a couple of weeks ago on precisely this issue. And, the fact is that social media is really the story of our age. Mainstream media is sadly not nearly as influential as we used to be. And, we haven't really, not just in Bangladesh, really, but anywhere in the world, got a real handle on how to deal with this new reality. But I mean, I think what one needs to be alive to the threat, and to the understanding that we are operating in a new media environment. There are no easy solutions, I fear, but just as we're sort of entering the last phase of our discussion, I just wanted to talk about what can then be done, because I think we all agree that the key for Bangladesh is not to have the election process derail. What advice would you have, let's say, for the interim government, the law enforcement authorities, the army, in fact, which is also part of the security apparatus in Bangladesh, certainly in the run-up to elections, to ensure that we get our free, fair, and festive elections? Because I think that is the key. I think at this moment, from now on, everything is going to be judged based on how good the elections are going to be.
Yeah. So again, I'll fall back on my past as a professor, and talk about strategy. The first step in strategy is knowing what your desired end state is. Where do you want to end up? So again, I think that's pretty easy. I think the interim government, all of us, can agree on what the desired end state is. Tactics, again, are important, but you can't just deal with tactics to try to reach a strategic goal. There's this intermediary level, which, again, in military terms is called the operational level of warfare. It's how do you plan operations that will lead to your strategic outcome. So I think this is where there needs to be, frankly, a battle plan that the interim government has of how to reach that goal, to make plans, to monitor those plans, and to realize, as I said before, the enemy has a vote. So knowing that there will be those who will try to disrupt the elections, knowing that there are those who have a different end state in mind, the government needs to be able to adapt. And the other thing, the final thing I would say is know who your friends are,
Yeah.
both domestically and internationally. So there are many international friends who can help, but international friends aren't going to determine the outcome. The government, even though it may not seem this way for people in the interim government, they still have a lot of friends in Bangladesh. They have a lot of people in Bangladesh who want to see them succeed. And this is not a time for the interim government to go into the bunker, to go into their shell. They're getting a lot of criticism, including we've been critical of them today. But they need to listen to that criticism, but realize where it's coming from. So you and I, for example, and many others want this government to succeed. We will help where and as we can. And I think one of the things the government has to do is realize that there's a broad cross section of Bangladeshi society that wants them to succeed and wants to work with them. And I think an approach which brings those people in and gives them a seat at the table and enlists their help is the one that's most likely to lead to the outcome that we all want to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think we shouldn't forget the fact that the vast majority of the Bangladeshi people and all of the, the mainstream political parties participating in the election do want this election. The people trying to derail it are at this stage a fairly small minority. So this is the time to reach out to understand that, when it comes to elections, the BNP, the Jamaat-e-Islam, the NCP, they're all on the same page, is the interim government. And I think to then treat this as a grand alliance. And as I said, probably somewhere, according to polls, upwards of 80% of the Bangladeshi people are also part of this coalition. So I mean, I think that's a very strong base on which to move forward. And as you say, rather than hunker down in a bunker, is to be more expansive. I think that's excellent. That's excellent advice. I think the other thing which the government really needs to do is they should probably understand that, at least in the last 2 months, and I have understood, it makes sense, as you said, it's an unstable coalition. They don't have the power that an elected government has in terms of in terms of being able to enforce their writ and their authority. But in the last 2 months, I think it does behoove this government to really take a much, much stronger stand on law and order and make sure. And as I said, I've understood why in the last year and a half, maybe they felt it was a little bit difficult for them to confront mobs, crowds, such as we saw the other night. But I think probably the lesson to be learned from this is that this has to become a non-negotiable element of the last 2 months, is that the writ in the authority of the government in its law enforcement apparatus has to be absolute. And I think, maybe they didn't want that to be the case, or they thought that was not possible to do in the last 18 months, but it absolutely must be operationalized in the next 2. And I think, and my sense is that if the site of the Daily Star and Prothom on fire did not hit home, did not bring that home, I can't imagine what would. So my guess would be that what we're saying, what you are saying, what I'm saying, is very apparent to the government. So let's hope that they will take all of that to heart. I think we've gone well over our assigned 30 minutes. I think, yes, 45 minutes now, but this was an important subject to discuss, which is why I'm glad we took the time. Any final words, John?
Yeah, just the final thing, just to build on your final point as well, is that the coalition of those who can help the government also includes the business community, media organizations, civil society, religious groups. So it's a big tent, and then communication. I
Yeah.
think the chief advisor and others need to take the people into confidence. I think back to the United States history, President Roosevelt and his fireside chats. When the
Yeah.
country is going through a difficult time and there's uncertainty, they need to know that their leadership is connected to them. And Professor Yunus showed the other day after Hadi's death that he's capable of doing that. and he needs to keep doing it, and we need to keep doing what we're doing. And from my side, I'm committed to doing that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of those who have been tuning in live. I know it is from 10 to 10:45 on a Saturday morning, so my suspicion is it's not a large number, but I anticipate many people will see us subsequently as this is posted on social media, and I hope that this engenders more of a discussion, and I hope we can carry on talking. Thank you very much, and thank you, John.